Hello, everyone in podcast land. Welcome to this week's episode.
On this week's episode of the podcast, we talk about surprise announcements from Apple.
We're talking about more Samsung Galaxy S23 leaks.
And we talk about the tech industry continuing to shrink as Microsoft lays off thousands of people.
Okay, topic number one, surprise product drops from Apple. So last week on Tuesday, there was just a random video uploaded to Apple's YouTube page, and they announced new products that they had. I mean, there wasn't really much talk about these products beforehand. Funny enough, in our last podcast, we were talking about, it's going to be a slow year for Apple. There's not going to be that much stuff to talk about. I think Mark Gurman even said that, we might get the MacBook Pros, but probably not until the fall. Maybe even like winter time is when they might come out with it. It's going to be a very slow year. And literally like the next day after we uploaded our podcast, Apple releases this event and they have their M2 chips coming to their new MacBook Pros, right? So they have the M2 Pro, they have the M2 Max chip, and that's in the 14 and 16 inch MacBook Pros. And, of course, these are the best chips they've ever made, the fastest chips they've ever made, most energy efficient chips they've ever made. For the MacBook Pros, nothing changes on the outside. There's nothing really new about the exterior of these. So it's all just, internal upgrades to the devices. But, when it comes to CPU, GPU, and neural engine performance, respectively, they're 20, 30, and 40% better than M1 Max or M1 Pro and M1 Max. So let's say if you're someone who's in the market for M1 Pro or M1 Max 14 or 16 inch MacBook Pro, it's perfect timing for you because, hey, I was just ready to buy this device at, let's say, I think 2,000 American, right? Entry price. And now here's a new product that is exactly the same thing, but now better, 20, 30, 40% better when it comes to CPU, GPU, and neural engine performance. One thing that really caught me by surprise was they decided to also upgrade the Mac Mini, and they put the M2 chip in the Mac Mini, which was, kind of expected that to happen at some point, but they also have an option for an M2 Pro chip in a Mac Mini, which makes perfect sense to me, but it's something that I didn't think I would ever see Apple do, or I definitely didn't expect Apple to do, because it makes a lot of sense and is very pro-consumer, right? But they came out MacBook Pros, Mac Mini, and then the following day, so on Wednesday last week, they also updated the HomePod. Now, they canceled the original HomePod because people weren't buying it. There wasn't, I guess, a great response to it. And they were only offering the HomePod Mini, but now they've resurrected the HomePod. And I think compared to the last version of it, it has 4 microphones compared to, I think the previous one had 6 or 7. It has 5 tweeter speakers compared to the last one, which had 7 tweeters. So it's not as powerful of a speaker. But, they have temperature sensors, humidity. It works with Siri. It's sort of like a smart home hub. So there are some improvements, but it's kind of funny that it's like, hey, we canceled this device because nobody wanted it, but now we've made it worse than it was before, technically, and we're bringing it back. So hopefully people like it again. But I was definitely caught off guard by the event, especially because, last week we said, don't expect any MacBook Pros anytime soon. It's almost like Apple's like, oh yeah, you guys think we're not doing anything? All right, here you go. But I'm sure you were caught off guard by the event too, but what do you think of the products that they released when it comes to the MacBook Pros, the Mac Mini, the HomePod? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was quite surprised as well. And I think maybe some people were expecting that if we were going to get a new MacBook Pro, that we would also get like an updated design, not an overhaul of the design, but something maybe a little bit more updated in the sense of maybe something to do with the notch. Maybe the notch goes away. Maybe we get the pill. Maybe there's like some change to the mouse or something like that. Who knows? But I think it was always under, at least from my impression, that it would just be a chip bump, kind of like what happened with the 13-inch MacBook Pro. So I think Apple did everything they needed to do with the MacBook Pros, and I understand that maybe this announcement isn't as exciting, which is why they didn't do like the whole keynote thing where Tim Cook, you know, talks to everybody for a bit, and then you go through Apple Park for a good hour or 40 minutes or so. And yeah, I don't think that that was needed here, but I agree with you. I think if you're someone who was in the market for getting a new MacBook Pro, this is great news because they've just updated it and made it better. The one thing I still have trouble with is once again Apple's marketing. Like you mentioned, 20% better CPU performance, 30% better GPU performance, based on last year's models. Now, here's the thing: really, it's kind of confusing because Apple is very very opaque, and they're not really showing you the breakdown of efficiency and performance cores compared to last year. So from what I can tell, it seems like the base level M1 or M2 Pro gets six efficiency cores and six performance cores and four efficiency cores, which would be only two more efficiency cores than the M1 Pro. So it's kind of hard to understand where this huge performance gains are coming from. Obviously, there's going to be other things like clock speed and memory bandwidth. We don't know anything about clock speed, but we do know memory bandwidth will remain the same between the M1 Pro, M2 Pro, M1 Max, and M2 Max. So it makes me very skeptical of Apple's numbers, and especially based on their previous history when they've talked about their GPU performance competing with something like a 3080 and a 3090, and that just was absolutely not true. It kind of makes me very wary of the performance of these M2 machines being significantly better than the M1s. And I think we saw that with, the base level M2 machines like the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which most people were like, yeah, this isn't really that big of a difference from last year. So I think that's why we didn't get a big event, and maybe there was even some conversations within Apple of maybe delaying the product, maybe to get it a little bit more exciting. But I do think this was the better move overall. Yes, it's an incremental jump. It's probably not as dramatic as even the numbers make it seem, and the numbers aren't even really all that dramatic to begin with, because those are best case scenarios of 20 and 30%. I imagine on the day to day, it's not going to be that impressive. But regardless, still the right move to do. The Mac Mini was a bit of a surprise for me because that is a machine that Apple has notoriously neglected over the years, where they'd bring out a new model and they'd let that model sit there for like half a decade before they upgrade it. But they did upgrade it this time, and not only did they give it the M2 chip, but they gave it the M2 Pro, which is amazing. It's much more expensive. It's $900 more than the base level M2 chip, but that gives you an awesome kind of middle gap between that machine and then the Mac Studio, which is about $800 to $900 more than that. I'm talking Canadian dollars here. It might be a little bit less than that in American dollars. But yeah, there is still a price gap, and I think this is good. This is one of those situations where Apple has a good product line in terms of price difference, where it's not as confusing as something like, let's say, an iPhone and an iPhone Pro. This is very, very distinct price differences between these machines. And I think the M1 Pro Mac Mini is a great option for people who want a Pro desktop, but don't necessarily need the Max chip or the Ultra chip, which are mostly going to give you better GPU performance. And I think that was something that was missing before in the desktop market, with the iMac, being not one of their best machines, especially the base level. But if you needed really, really good CPU performance, but you didn't really need the high-end GPU performance, you were kind of left out in the cold because there wasn't a middle gap. Now with this M1 Pro Mac Mini, you have that, and I think that's a great option. The HomePod, another surprising one, like you mentioned, canceled, and very similar design overall. Like you mentioned, there's a little bit of a downgrade in the specs. And I don't know if this is going to be any better than the original HomePod was. There are a couple of features that I do think are really cool, like the screen at the top. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a Amazon device, like an Echo Show or something like that, or Echo Spot, The only thing I wonder is Apple actually going to show you information on that, or are they just going to show you a gradient of colors? Because in a lot of the marketing, it's just showing like this gradient of colors on the screen, which is kind of useless. I would love, for there to be, and obviously they talked about the humidity sensors and stuff like that, but I would love there to be actual information that I can look at a glance without having to activate Siri or ask a question or something like that. Maybe just information can come up contextually. I think would be really, really cool. Kind of like how Amazon Echo devices are. They just kind of have an ambient display that will just show you things like the time and stuff like that, um, without you having to even interact with the device. I hope Apple does that. But also, I think the original HomePod had this feature as well with the stereo feature where you can put two of them on either side of your TV,
Yeah.
and it would kind of be like a stereo system. As much as I think the HomePod's whole lineup is kind of dumb, especially compared to like the Google Home or the Nest Home devices that we have now that are relatively affordable and pretty cool. I will say, in terms of wireless speakers, if they perform well, I think they might be the coolest looking in terms of like a nice minimalist setup for a TV. So like if you just had like $600 laying around and you wanted to get some really fancy speakers, yeah, I would go for the Apple ones, especially if you're involved in the Apple ecosystem and you use an Apple TV and stuff like that. Because the unfortunate thing is, as cool as that will look, it will not work with anything other than the Apple TV. So it's not like you can hook up your actual TV to this and have all your programming come through your speakers. It's only going to be the stuff you watch on Apple TV.
Oh, really?
So yeah,
I didn't
yeah. So
realize
as
that.
cool as that is, I mean, it's kind of like a huge. I don't know. It could be cooler, and I think Apple needs to go an extra mile to make these things more compatible with more ecosystems if they want this kind of lineup to be successful. But that product comes out February 3rd, so just about a month, and the Mac products come out January 24th. So yeah, I think this is definitely just Apple getting these products out there, getting the word out there, and not necessarily doing the most exciting presentation overall, which I didn't think was necessary overall either.
Yeah, definitely not necessary. Probably more cost effective too, considering they just cut Tim Cook's pay in half essentially. I think it's
Yeah,
by like 40%.
yeah,
Maybe they couldn't afford Tim Cook after after they cut his salary because he didn't show up in this video at all,
yeah,
right? But not a huge production, but I'd say I don't know it seemed very pro consumer, at least from a Mac user standpoint.
mhm,
Usually, at least I don't know. I feel like Apple usually does a lot of stuff that's like, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. This isn't like good for the consumer, let's say, right? But them upgrading the chips in the MacBook Pros, and I guess partly because I didn't expect it to happen, especially not this early in the year. So I was excited for that, excited to see that. And one thing, you know, I at least always kind of make fun of Apple because they're always comparing, oh, to this is compared to the best selling desktop PC, or this is
yeah,
compared to like the Intel Mac, from 2019. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course it's gonna be better than the Intel Mac from 2019. Why do you still compare it? But like the more I think about it and the more I see these things, I'm like, there's still quite a few people who use Intel MacBooks. Like MacBook Pros have a pretty good life. I feel at least, from friends who have Windows laptops, I feel like they get slow pretty quickly, whether it's from the manufacturer, the OEMs, or whether it's from the updates that Windows pushes. It seems like they don't last as long as MacBooks. I mean, I'm still using a MacBook Pro from 2012 and it does the job, right? And there's still quite a few people, especially if you look at students or people who just got out of college or university, who have like a 4 or 5 year old MacBook Pro or MacBook Air that still works well and still gets the job done. But it's like, hey, compared to an Intel Mac, which a lot of people still use, this is how much better it is. So I think I've kind of decided that I'm not going to, I guess, harp on Apple as much for comparing to Intel Macs, because there are still quite a few people, especially if you think, okay, 2019 isn't that long ago, right? It's only what, 3, 4 years ago now. There's still quite a few people who bought a MacBook, bought an Apple device that was still running Intel chips, And that device is still working to this day, and it's probably still going to work for another, 3, 4 more years. So yeah, I'm going to give Apple a pass on this one. And another thing that's very pro consumer, and I mentioned this before, the Mac Mini. When Apple Silicon first came out and they had the M1 chip in the Mac Mini, I think for both of us, that was our favorite product of the. They had the MacBook Air, the MacBook Pro 13-inch, and the Mac Mini, and we're like, this one makes the most sense. It's not charging you that Apple premium of, oh, we have this unibody design and we have a touch bar and we have liquid retina display. Like, it was just a computer that was very reasonably priced and had very good performance. And the fact that they finally brought the M2 chip to the Mac Mini, it's still very reasonably priced and has good performance. And I actually think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's $100 less than the M1 version.
Mhm.
So not only did they improve the performance with a newer chip, which I mean, yes, a year later you're going to have a better chip. Not only did they improve the performance, but they lowered the price, which is also something that Apple very rarely does. And not only that, they gave you the option for an M2 Pro chip. Because I think even when the M2 Pro and the M1 Max chips came out, we said, why don't they put this in a Mac Mini? It could definitely handle that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see that for the second generation of Apple Silicon, they finally figured out, hey, yeah, okay, this Mac Mini can definitely handle an M2 Pro chip. It could have handle an M2 Max, but then you kind of start cutting into the market share of the Mac Studio. So okay, you don't need to put that chip in it. But as you said, this kind of creates like a nice cost ladder of, if you want just M1, then you get the, if you just want Apple Silicon, get the base Mac Mini, then you can go a step up to the M2 Pro, and then I'm sure by the end of this year or maybe next year even, we're gonna get the M2 Max in the Mac Studio and then the M2 Ultra. So there's a nice little, step ladder where, hey, I need a little bit more performance, but I don't want to go from the M2 to the M2 Max. There's a little stopgap in between, which, given consumers more options and more options that make sense, I think is a great thing to do. And I feel like I don't usually say that about Apple. So, the times that they do it, I guess, I'll give them a pat on the back. But yeah, I would say I still think the Mac Mini is the best product. And I also, for quite some time, rumors have been saying that there's going to be a redesign to the Mac Mini. And I think that if we did get a redesign with these M2 chips, I think Apple would have used that as an excuse. Or, I mean, there's obviously research and development that goes into it, but I definitely don't think they would have lowered the price. If anything, I think they would have raised the price. So, yes, it's an old form factor, but it still works perfectly fine. And it's a great way to get into the Apple Silicon ecosystem. I'm just glad that not only did they bring the M2 chip finally, not only did they lower the price, but they also gave you more options with the Mac Mini
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
more ports. And more ports.
Yes, I was actually just going to mention that. I completely agree with you on the front of the Mac Mini, because not only did the Mac Mini have pretty good ports before with USB-A ports, one of the only machines Apple
Yes.
has that actually has them,
Yes.
but the new Pro version actually has the same ports with an added 2 more Thunderbolt ports. So it has 4 Thunderbolt ports in total.
And HDMI 2.1 as an option.
And HDMI 2 more.
And
Exactly.
10 gig
Ethernet.
Ethernet. Yeah.
So 100% a great option, and I couldn't agree with you more about the Mini. Still, Apple's, I would say it's their best product in terms of being consumer friendly.
Yes, definitely.
And I hope that this is a sign that they will do that with the 13-inch MacBook Pro, lower the price, and also add an M2 Pro chip in that, because I think that would make that a much more compelling option to be a gap between. Yeah, maybe even get rid of the touch bar, but I think that would be a great option as a gap between the MacBook Air, which I think right now is a little overpriced, and the MacBook Pros. The one thing I will say is, based on Apple's comparisons, I still disagree with that for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that the 2019 MacBook Pro was not a good machine. So comparing, a supposedly good machine to a machine that should have never come out in the first place, I think is a little bit kind of frustrating to me, because First of all, the processors in that machine were already very, very old. They were ancient, even when they came out in 2019. So it shouldn't have came out with those processors to begin with, but also it just wasn't properly cooled. Apple used this design that just wasn't great for cooling those chips. And now they're comparing this redesigned machine to that. It just, to me, it's more of an issue of Apple designed a poor machine to begin with. So comparing it to that is it's a little bit sketchy to me. But that's, I can deal with that a little bit. Where I'm much more concerned about is their comparisons to Windows machines. Because when they try to compare it to Windows machines that have similar price, they outright lie about the performance, like with the GPU performance in the past. So, but more often than not, they compare to machines that are like $1,500 cheaper. Like when you're comparing a desktop to the best-selling Windows desktop, which is probably like $300 to $400, it's not even in the same class. So, I find that to be quite sketchy. And it's something that I'll never. Their marketing in general is something that I really think should change to be a little bit more consumer friendly. I think right now it's very manipulative, and it's kind of hard to show, like, let's say someone who doesn't necessarily understand the specs, what about this is actually better. And I always try to break it down that when it comes to the M1 and M2 processors and Apple Silicon in general, the main thing you should be looking at, because you will get a better performance for the money elsewhere. It's just something that will happen. But the one thing you will not get is better efficiency. And I think that's the thing that I think Apple should be playing up more, instead of like these kind of narratives that may not be true or may be kind of fudged a bit. Talk about how efficient these machines are and stay on that, because I think that's where these machines shine. And especially for something like a laptop, when you can be unplugged from the wall for 10 hours and not have to worry about it while you're editing video, that's fantastic. But yeah, that's just my take on that. And I do hope Apple's marketing gets a little bit more, or a little less opaque in the future, because I really think it could help people who are trying to buy these machines going forward.
Definitely. And they have all these graphs where they show like how much better the performance is for their stuff compared to even like their older stuff, or to, as you said, Windows laptops or desktops. But then it's okay, you got to look in the fine print to
Yeah,
see exactly what they're comparing this to, and to
yeah,
see exactly how this is being compared. And when they're doing their presentations, when they're doing their YouTube videos, you don't have time for that,
yeah.
right? Unless you pause a video, go rewind, zoom in. But most of the times it's, you're watching the video, you get excited because they say all this stuff and they show you all these cool vivid, these cool transitions and all these cool graphs, and then you're like, oh, it comes out next week. Yeah, sure, I'm gonna pre-order it and buy it. Not to say that they aren't good products, but like, yeah, their graphs, their statements, some of the things they say in their presentations are definitely opaque and misleading.
And they don't need to be, because they're great products.
Yeah,
That's the
they
funny
are.
part.
Yeah, just like as you said, kind of focus on what they are truly great at.
Yeah.
Final question.
Mhm.
Are you any more interested in getting a Mac Mini now, or even possibly an M1 Mac Mini, assuming that they drop the prices now that there's an M2 Mac Mini? But, considering how consumer friendly this device is, how pro consumer, how good of a deal this is, and especially in terms of Mac products, are you interested at all in getting a Mac Mini?
That It's still tough for me, for a couple of reasons. One, I do love PC gaming. Macs just aren't at that level yet, and I think that could change relatively soon if Apple wants to. But also, I like to upgrade. I like things that I can upgrade, like in piecemeal. And I understand like these things can last very long, but even my current desktop, I've had since 2014. It works well for me. For the most part, it is, struggling in some things like editing, but I've always loved the fact that I can, if I needed more RAM, I could get more RAM. If I needed, to upgrade my CPU, I can get a CPU secondhand and put it in my machine to get a little bit more performance. It's not going to be great or crazy. It's not going to like make this thing last another 10 years, but those options do exist. And it's just, I hopefully the upcoming Mac Pro allows for that, although that will be way out of my price range. But hopefully something like that will allow for that. But yeah, for me, it's just the fact that it's just, okay, this is the machine. you buy it like this and you can't do anything with it. You can't even upgrade the storage. For me, and this is just me personally, I don't think this should be a negative for most people out there, but for me, it's something that I personally like to, get something, and then if I need more storage overall, like for example, over the past 10 years, I've added like 3 terabytes of storage to my PC because of all the games that are on it, and I just like that option. So yeah, I don't know, it's still a no for me, but I still think it's a fantastic product, and I'm very happy that Apple makes it. I guess to ask that question back to you, does this new lineup of Mac Minis, do you think that this is, if you were going for a new PC right now, would you go for the Mac Mini and sacrifice the portability, or are you still interested in something like the MacBook Air or even a MacBook Pro?
That's definitely a question. Definitely a question I'm considering right now. The entry level Mac Mini is such a good deal.
Yeah.
It's such a good deal that it's like it's hard to not want to get that. But as you said, the portability, because a MacBook Air, I feel is also a good deal,
Yeah.
right? I like the design of it, and obviously I like the performance. It's the same chip that's in the Mac Mini, but I could take it around with me. I could take it into the office. I could be in a coffee shop working. I could be, on the train working. And you can't do that with a Mac Mini. Yes, it's a desktop. Of course, you can't do that. But then, at least in Canadian dollars, right, I have to ask myself, is being able to take this thing on the road with me worth $700?
Hmm.
Right? So, yeah, definitely a question that I'm kind of mulling over right now. But I'd say the Mac lineup is pretty compelling, at least from a Mac user standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Topic number 2. So we have even more leaks from the Galaxy S23 phones before their February launch event. And last week we had the pictures of the phones, we had some marketing promotional pictures. Now we have spec leaks. And there were rumors circulating around that, okay, the S23 Ultra is going to have a 200 megapixel phone. It seems like that is, in fact, confirmed. It is going to have a 200 megapixel phone. And this comes from a leak from, I believe, a European site in France and Germany. It seems like the promotional material for those regions, it seems like it's been leaked early, and it confirms some of the specs. So just to read off of the S23 Ultra, the flagship device, it's going to have a 200 megapixel main camera. It's going to have 3 additional rear cameras, a 12 megapixel ultra wide, a 10 megapixel telephoto with 3x optical zoom, and a second 10 megapixel telephoto with 10x optical zoom. In terms of the screen, of course, the biggest Samsung has to offer, 6.8-inch 1440p OLED, 120 hertz refresh rate, supposed to have a massive battery, 5,000 milliamp hours too, fast charging, up to 45 watts. I mean, it's a big device, big camera, big screen, big battery. It's the best Samsung has to offer. But I mean, if you compare that to our last story where, just days before this event, everyone was saying, oh, yeah, they're not coming up with MacBook Pros, probably not till fall, maybe next year. And then all of a sudden, boom, here's new Macs, new Mac Mini, new HomePod, compared to Samsung, where we have what the devices are going to look like, what the internals are going to be. I mean, I guess the only thing missing is there's bound to be some sort of software feature where it's, I can't even think of what software feature they might throw in, but it's a very stark contrast comparing from Apple's surprise launch to, we essentially know exactly what you're going to say a month before this event happens.
Yeah.
So, I guess what are your thoughts on the specs of the Samsung phones? I mean, they generally do have the biggest and best that Android phones have to offer. But I guess what are your thoughts on the leaks also happening so early?
I mean, it feels like it's just par for the course in terms of leaks, especially in the Android space and the Apple space as well, specifically with iPhones. But based on what we've seen from like Pixels so far in advance to this particular device, I mean, I don't know what these guys are gonna do to try to stop these leaks because I would imagine they don't like them. Um, but there's one thing about this performance, or the leaked performance of these machines, that is quite interesting. We've talked about on this podcast in the past, the idea is that these are going to be using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip instead of the Exynos chips, and potentially even a special version of that chip. More than the cameras, this gets me excited because recently we've seen a couple of videos of this new Red Magic phone that is like a gaming phone, and it's running the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 chip. It's one of the first devices to really show just how powerful this chip can be. And I gotta be honest, I'm kind of blown away with the performance of this. This is something that I'm not used to seeing in the Android space. Like, Qualcomm comes out with these new chips and they talk about all this performance similar to Apple, and like they give us these vague numbers and these vague graphs, but really when it comes to real world usage, it doesn't really amount to much. But I've seen a video where someone has used this particular Red Magic phone running the 8 Gen 2 chip to run GameCube games in 4K. And to me, that just blows my mind because there's almost no devices, like the Steam Deck can't even do that, right? So it's one of those things of like, it's kind of making me really excited that if there is an even more upgraded version of this chip coming to Samsung phones, whether it's more efficient or more powerful or whatnot, it just makes me think that these could be the performance king for Android phones, which is something we haven't seen from Samsung since like the Galaxy S2 days. And I think that is what really propelled them to be really kind of special in the Android phone market, and which propelled them to be the most popular phone in that market. And if they can pull that off again, I think that would be really, really exciting to see. And our third topic for the podcast is some news coming from Microsoft. Microsoft is planning on laying off 10,000 people this week. And this is really big. So not only is this going to be a layoff at Microsoft, but this is also potentially going to affect the Xbox division, and it's going to even affect the hardware division even more, apparently. So, we've talked on the podcast in the past about the potential of a Surface Duo 3 and them making changes to that machine that I'm not a big fan of, but who knows, might make it a more popular device overall. But the Surface line is something that Microsoft has been working on for a long time. They are very well-made products in terms of their hardware. A lot of people are really big fans of them. We don't really know how successful they are. They are very expensive, and I think maybe this could be a sign that maybe Microsoft is looking to take a step back from the hardware division, because there are some signs that there are going to be some major layoffs to that division. But also the Xbox division. It's been reported that these layoffs will also affect Bethesda and 343 Industries, specifically in the Xbox Game Studios lineup. And I think why this is really important is Bethesda was Xbox's last purchase. They just purchased them. And the idea that they also want to spend $69 billion on purchasing Activision Blizzard. And what does that mean? Does that mean that, if Microsoft does get Activision Blizzard, there's going to be even more layoffs of that studio because there's going to be a lot of doubled up of maybe jobs and stuff like that? Or does that mean that Microsoft maybe didn't take into account its current employee staff and maybe think about, hey, maybe it doesn't make sense for us to spend all these billions and billions of dollars to acquire the biggest gaming company in the world when we can't really keep our own employees employed, essentially? And I think this is an important question to ask, because this is not a small amount of people. This is 10,000 people, and this is coinciding with thousands upon thousands of people who have been laid off already in the tech industry. We talked about late last year about obviously what happened at Twitter, but then there was also, I think, close to 18,000 people laid off at Amazon. So this is a continuing trend that is quite concerning. But then on top of that, these layoffs are also going to affect 343 Industries. And the word coming on around that is that 343 Industries was not maybe the best managed team. I believe former employee Patrick Wren tweeted out that these layoffs should have never happened and that there was a lot of issues with leadership of that team. But then also we're getting news that potentially this could mean the end of 343 Industries developing Halo games. And that is doubly sad because Halo Infinite was very, very well received, especially in the single player aspect. But there were issues there. There were issues specifically with the fact that there is still no local co-op for single player, and they announced that that was not going to happen. And not only that, there's been a lot of criticism on the multiplayer not getting enough content as quickly as it should, and that could probably coincide with the lack of leadership. So apparently, with these major layoffs happening in the Xbox kind of ecosystem, and specifically at 343, this could mean that not only will 343 not make future Halo games, and instead they will be developed by a third-party studio outside of Microsoft, but also this could mean that we may not see 343 Industries develop any major games going forward from now on. It may just be relegated to a support studio, which is, it goes back to a question we had long, long ago when we first heard about this Activision acquisition about, well, does it make sense spending $69 billion, and could this be an antitrust issue because Microsoft could have just invested that money in-house and develop their own studios? And it seems like right now they're doing the opposite. They're kind of hindering their own studios to go purchase outside studios, which I wonder if I'm, the FTC, is this concerning to me? Is this concerning that a company who is in this space is acquiring another company of something that they already do while laying off their own employees at the same time? I think that could be concerning. But yeah, this is just a really kind of messy situation. I'm curious, have you heard much about this Microsoft layoff or the mass layoffs that have been going around in the tech industry? And do you think that maybe Microsoft is not doing best by its employees, especially in the Xbox ecosystem, when they're trying to spend close to $70 billion to purchase Activision?
Yeah, I've heard a bit about the layoffs in, the tech industry. So this past week, the number I heard was 11,000 layoffs at Microsoft. I heard the 18,000 at Amazon, but also Alphabet, the parent company of Google, is laid off, or they're planning to lay off 12,000 people. So this is all around like, a 1 week span. There's at least 40,000 people in the tech industry that are getting laid off, which is pretty unfortunate to hear, and pretty sad to hear. And for the past, I guess, 6 months, right, we've been hearing talks and rumblings of a recession. But I mean, when you hear 40,000 people in 1 week, that's really like, it's not a maybe anymore. It seems like the recession is here,
Yeah.
or at least in the tech industry. And how do I feel Microsoft is handling it? Well, yeah, like if you're spending $70 billion acquiring a gaming company, you would assume it's because everything is all right at home.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't assume that it's, oh, I'm spending $70 billion, so I have to lay off 11,000 people, right? Like you said, maybe that would have been better spent in house and, developing their own workforce, or developing their own game studios, or, better managing 343, or better supporting Halo Infinite, or better, there's thousands of other things that this $70 billion could have gone to other than Activision Blizzard. And that deal hasn't even gone through yet,
Yeah.
right? They just, last month or maybe a month and a half ago, the FTC sued to block the deal. So this deal might not even go through because the FTC might block it, or it might go through and then PlayStation is going to sue to block it, or it just might not go through because maybe Activision won't accept the terms because, hey, you just laid off 11,000 of your own people. You're going to buy us and lay off another 11,000 of our people. So there's a lot up in the air. And yeah, it's the more this deal, this Activision Blizzard acquisition stretches on, the more it seems like it's not actually going to happen. And who knows, maybe Microsoft decides to pull the plug themselves on the deal. And, then we're talking about, okay, what's going to happen with Activision Blizzard? Because they were expecting to get purchased for $70 billion. And so if this deal falls through, Activision Blizzard doesn't get the $70 billion. Phil Spencer isn't running Activision Blizzard anymore. So then now they're in an even worse spot than they were before. Right. So yeah, it's definitely troubling times for Microsoft and Xbox gaming and Activision Blizzard and everyone, but also, the tech industry at large, right? When you talk about Alphabet and you talk about Amazon, like these are the biggest tech companies that you thought, not to say that they were recession proof, but if there's anyone who you would think like, okay, no, they are able to navigate the recession, right? These are massive layoffs coming. I think out of the big tech companies, the only one that hasn't had massive layoffs yet is Apple, you
Yeah.
know? So maybe we're just waiting for the shoe to drop there. But if you think of, the past year, we've had layoffs from Twitter, right? We've had layoffs from Alphabet. We've had layoffs from Meta, aka Facebook. Like the layoffs are hitting the tech industry at large right now. So I mean, maybe Apple is the last one standing where it's okay, we won't fire like half of our workforce because we keep on pumping out iPhones and we keep on pumping out MacBooks and iPads and people want to buy them. So, I mean, but I guess that's another thing too, right? We just talked about or we just mentioned the huge pay cut that Tim Cook took and maybe it's hey, maybe some more executives need to be doing that, right? Not to say that they're not taking pay cuts. I'm sure that they're trying to do what's in the best interest of their companies and their employees, but I mean, yeah, it's especially coming out of 2020, right? 2020 was a booming year for the tech industry, partly because everyone was at home and, buying a lot of electronics and everything was virtual. So, yes, tech is going to boom because of that. But we were hearing about record numbers of hirings in tech companies, and now we're probably record numbers of firings. So yeah, I'm sure this isn't the last of the massive layoffs that we'll hear, but definitely troubling to see. And hopefully Microsoft could kind of right the ship, especially when it comes to gaming, because yeah, we like games.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a good point because in 2020, and I think even Mark Zuckerberg said this when he talked about the layoffs at Facebook, they expected the boom that they were experiencing in 2020 to continue. And I don't know why anyone would have considered that to continue. To me, that just seems like really dumb leadership at that point because a lot of that was based off of stimulus to kind of jumpstart the economy at the beginning of the pandemic, which was going to end. So the idea that companies were just banking on that level of spending to continue for forever to me is quite stupid. Um, and unfortunately, the people who pay for it are the people who are losing their jobs. So it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, yeah, this is really, really bad leadership that made really, really bad decisions, and they're not really the ones that have to pay for it all that much, other than maybe losing a little bit in their stock valuation that they own. But then you also mentioned someone like Phil Spencer, who, when the Activision Blizzard deal was going through, obviously Activision Blizzard was going through a lot of issues with its CEO, Bobby Kotick, and a lot of issues in the company. And he came out and said, hey, I'm going to make sure that this ship is run right when this deal closes. And it kind of makes me wonder. Obviously, the majority of these layoffs are happening outside of the Xbox division. So I don't want to make it seem like Xbox is the only reason why this is happening. But there has been a lot of issues at Xbox. And I've said on the podcast in the past, especially when the Bethesda deal happened, that Phil Spencer is one of my favorite gaming executives out of all the companies. I think he's great. He says the right things. He seems like he allows his teams to take the time they need to make games and not have to worry about stuff like crunch, which apparently still exists. But at least it seems a little bit. It seems like there's at least conversation about that happening at Xbox, where that doesn't happen in other companies. Uh, but I mean, maybe there is some of the blame that needs to be placed on his shoulders in terms of the lack of performance of something like Halo. And even though, and this is the sad part, Halo was a very, very well received game. I'm not going to talk too much about reviews because I think reviews in most cases are kind of stupid. But the sentiment around that game was very, very positive, especially the single player. So he did the right move by delaying that game. And 343 did a great job by developing a really fun, great game that was even in Game of the Year conversations when it came out. So, but I still think that there's potential. A lot of this stuff does need to fall on his shoulders. He's the leader of that ship. He's probably the one who pitched this Activision Blizzard deal. And I think maybe a lot of those jobs that have been lost need to fall on his shoulders. And maybe he needs to although I'm pretty sure he doesn't get paid nearly as much as Tim Cook.
Probably
but maybe
not.
he needs to do something in terms of taking a little bit of responsibility for this. And I don't want to say like maybe he needs to be replaced because I still think he's one of the best executives in the gaming industry.
Yeah.
But I think there does need to be at least some conversation from him about not doing best by his employees. And same thing with Satya Nadella, right? He's the CEO of Microsoft. 10 to 11,000 people being laid off. You need a better statement than what came out from him. Like this can't just be like, oh yeah, this is another day in the office, like what a lot of these companies are doing. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, and obviously Elon with Twitter, which was just kind of really sad. But yeah, I think there needs to be a little bit more weight on what's happening with these layoffs, and potentially maybe even some investigation. Like, what is the reason for these mass layoffs, and especially when you're hearing about a lot of these companies making record profits. So it's like it's weird. It's just a weird kind of situation to be in, because unlike previous recessions, it seems like this is like, okay, one day a company will make a ton of money and then they'll make a huge acquisition, but then they'll also lay off almost a country's worth of people. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's a weird kind of situation overall.
definitely weird. But yeah, I guess if you had to predict, do you think from these big tech companies like Microsoft, Alphabet, Amazon, Meta, do you think we continue to see massive layoffs like this? Or do you think, all right, I don't know, they had a massive leak in the boat and they fixed the leak and okay, we've laid off a bunch of people, we've trimmed the fat, we're very efficient now, no more layoffs, or do you think this
Uh,
is the most of it, or do you think this is the beginning of it?
I think this is the middle of it. And the reason why I say that is from someone with, this is very anecdotal evidence, but personal experience. It's been leading up to this. Like, the tech industry has been hiring and firing like this, like downsizing has been a part of the industry for a very long time. I definitely don't think this is the end for a couple of reasons. One, with these mass amount of layoffs all across the board, it means that there's a ton of people looking for jobs right now. And what will happen is a lot of these companies will be like, well, now there is competition for these positions. So what I can do is I can start laying off a lot of my senior staff who have very senior pays or very senior pay and are making quite a bit. And I can hire back that position at a much lower cost. And I think we're going to start to see a lot of that happening. And also, this is something that's not just taking place in North America. This is something that's taking place all around the world. I think there was some statistic like in the tech industry, there's like almost 1,600 people being laid off a day, which is insane. And yeah, I think this is a trend that's going to continue to happen because of cost cutting. And it all stems from the 2020 kind of record profits that these companies were making. They want to continue those record profits. And the way they're going to do that is by lowering their payroll. And I think this is kind of a frustrating kind of situation, because if these companies took those record profits for what they were, flash in the pan, and kind of readjusted for what the new reality was going to be in the next coming years, I think that would have been, and especially getting their shareholders involved, of saying, hey, this is not what we're going to continue to see. But I think what's happening now is shareholders are starting to expect the kind of returns that they saw in 2020. And what
Mhm.
we're going to see is a lot of those companies, based off their shareholders, appeasing their shareholders, they're going to be like, well, we have to find a way to get as close to those numbers as possible. And that's going to be laying off a bunch of people, making our teams as lean as possible, and getting payroll as low as possible. So yeah, I definitely think this is the middle. We're going to start to see much more of these throughout the year, and probably for maybe the next 5 to 10 years to come.
All right.
Before we go, maybe just to end on a happier note, two things. One question I wanted to ask you was, did you get a chance to see The Last of Us at all? And do you have any like impressions of the show? Are you enjoying it? Do you think it's going to be a good one coming from HBO? Because there's a lot of buzz coming out from that right now.
I did watch The Last of Us, and I thought it was good. I thought it was a good first episode. I guess not technically not a pilot episode, or they've already been greenlit, but I thought it was a good episode. I think it's a good setup for the series, and I'm just interested to see where they take it and how they get there, because I've played both Last of Us games. Huge fan of the games.
Hmm.
Um, Huge fan of Naughty Dog too. I guess the publishers behind the games are developers, but there's a lot of story in the games. There's a
Yeah.
whole lot of story. There's a whole lot that goes on. So you know there are two games, and then I guess there's a prequel also. But I guess what I'm wondering is, do they take one season to tell the story of one game? Because I think it's only supposed to be 9 episodes, which in terms of TV series isn't that long, and especially in terms of how much there is to cover in The Last of Us, that isn't that long. So I would imagine that they don't tell the entire story of the first game in 9 episodes. I imagine it's going to break at some point. And I'm just curious, where do they end the season? How far do they get into the story of The Last of Us before the season ends? And then it's like, all right, you got to wait for next year to get the rest of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very excited. Someone who's a fan of the games, and Pedro Pascal. I mean, of course, The Mandalorian. How could I not be excited about that too? But I guess, have you seen the episode, and what do you think of it, if you have?
No, so I haven't. I haven't seen it, but I will say the conversation around the Last of Us show is very positive, and I'm just happy to hear that. Obviously, Naughty Dog is directly involved with this show as well. Like, they're essentially, this is the game being told in a new form by the creators of the game. So I think that's really cool, and it's just great to see like a video game be adapted in a way that seems to be capturing both the people who love the game, but also people who just love good TV. And the talk around this show is like, hey, this is the best thing since Game of Thrones. So that's really positive to hear, and I'm glad to hear it overall.
Yeah.
But I do want to give a shout out to something I did watch, and I guess this is my obligatory yearly shout out to Netflix for putting out great stuff at the end of the year. Something I completely missed and ignored was towards the end of 2022, they released a Matilda movie. And as a kid, there was this great Matilda movie that came out in 1996 that, was pretty universally beloved. It's a great movie. But that was an adaptation of the book. This is an adaptation of the play that was adapted from the book, and it's a musical. And I gotta say, it's one of the coolest things I've seen in a long time, and it's just a long-standing kind of thing with Netflix of releasing their best stuff in December. They did this with The Trial of Chicago 7 in the past. They did this with Tick Tick Boom, or towards the end of the year, I should say. Actually, I think Chicago 7 was a little bit different. But anyways, they released their best stuff towards the end of the year, and I think they continued it with that, and I'm kind of just really impressed to see what they've been doing. They're like the only streaming service, I still have to give them credit for this, that can get this creative and get this kind of out there with the kind of projects that they make. And yeah, I gotta give them props for that as well. So yeah, two great things coming out of media in terms of The Last of Us TV show and also this fantastic Matilda movie. It's a good thing. Kind of can't wait to see, because there will be more seasons of The Last of Us. Can't wait to see where they go as well.
Also, Glass Onion came out in November
Yes.
23rd. So
Yes,
that's what I thought
the
you were
point.
gonna say, not Matilda.
Yeah, well, hey, I will say, I don't even know what I would say which one is better between the two, but I will say that, yes, Glass Onion is another big shout out as well, because that movie is fantastic.
Yeah. Take it easy, everyone in podcast land.
Catch you in the next episode.